Welcome to Facing the Future, brought to you by the Concord Coalition on WKXL, New Hampshire's talk radio station. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Each week, we take a nonpartisan dive into topics related to the federal budget, the economy, and how it all affects our nation's future. This week, we'll discuss developments on Capitol Hill as the government has reopened, but little has changed about the major issues Congress needs to address. Among those issues are expiring enhanced premium subsidies under the Affordable Care Act, the fate of President Trump's tariff agenda, full-year government funding for the 9 annual appropriation bills that haven't yet been passed. They need to do that to avoid another shutdown at the end of January. And if you want to look a little bit beyond the midterm elections in 2026, there are the prospect of automatic cuts for Social Security and Medicare as soon as 2032. And if you think about that, that's only one Senate term away for those who are running for the Senate in 2026. So here to discuss all this and probably more is Ben Ritz. He is Vice President of Policy Development at the Progressive Policy Institute and Director of the PPI Center for Funding America's Future. Prior to joining PPI, Ben worked at the Bipartisan Policy Center, where he worked on retirement security issues and budget reform, including the debt limit. And then before joining BPC, Ritz served as Legislative Outreach Director for the Concord Coalition. And he's been on this show many times. Ben, welcome back to Facing the Future.
As always, good to be with you.
I'm going to try to follow this in semi-chronological order. It's kind of like, okay, Congress is back. Now what do we do? And the first thing up is the expiring ACA tax provisions, which is the issue that brought about the shutdown. So I want to begin there. As part of the deal to reopen the government, Senate Majority Leader John Thune promised that there would be a vote in the Senate on some sort of ACA premium tax credit reform. So you have written about what maybe should be done here. There's a difference between just a blanket extension and some sort of reform. So let me just throw it out there and say, what would you recommend?
So I think the big question facing Democrats as they get to decide what bill is voting on, because I think it's important to remember Thune gave the Democrats the opportunity to decide what bill is going to be voted on, is they have a choice between, are they going to put up a bill that just extends the expanded credits that were enacted during the COVID pandemic and extended in the Inflation Reduction Act, or are they going to do something that has some reforms baked in? I think if Democrats say we're going to do they're just going to throw something like a 3-year extension on the floor, which is what House Democrats are currently trying to get a discharge petition for to force a vote in the House, we know that's going to fail. And Republicans are not going to support it. I think they have an opportunity to push for something that includes some structural reforms that make this a more durable long-term policy, as opposed to what I think was the maybe overly generous policy enacted during the pandemic that made sense during the pandemic, but doesn't really make sense as long-term policy. And I think if they put something on there that is a more pragmatic, long-term focused reform, I think that will make it harder for Republicans to just dismiss it out of hand.
Let's just look at what would happen if they do nothing. I mean, the enhanced subsidies go away. Not all the ACA subsidies go away, but the ones that, as you laid out, were enacted during the pandemic.
So if the pandemic enhancement goes away, people who are on the ACA exchanges, by and large, the premiums go up across the board. Some estimates have showed that they would average a doubling of premiums for folks. I think the biggest issue is less the premiums for people who still get the credits. I think that's an issue, but I think the bigger issue is that it would bring back the benefit cliff. It used to be the case that at 400% of the federal poverty line, that people would immediately lose the entirety of any support. And so that creates a big benefit cliff. You earn $1 over the threshold, and suddenly you're losing thousands of dollars in tax credits. Healthcare is no longer affordable. That's a huge work disincentive. It's not a fair policy. It's very costly for individuals. It's bad for the healthcare system. And so I think the top priority needs to be making sure that cliff doesn't come back. And then related to that, keeping premiums affordable while also making it affordable for taxpayers too.
So that cliff was kind of a original design flaw of the ACA subsidies that the enhancement tried to get at, and so that may smoothing that out may be worth keeping. What's the there's a big cost if they just did the extension, isn't it? I mean, what's the cost?
It would be almost, it's a little less, but it would be almost $400 billion over 10 years if this policy is made permanent. And this is for a subsidy that goes to about 7% of the population. It's several times the size of the tax subsidy that goes to people who have employer sponsored health insurance. And so it's a pretty big cost if we're just going to make this permanent, or even if we're extending it for a couple years or even 1 year. We're really still baking in the idea that this is a long-term policy, and I think that's going to have significant cost to it.
And the subsidies are going to people, some people, I mean, anyway, with high income that you wouldn't think of as people that would qualify for government subsidies.
Oh yeah, I mean the subsidies can be pretty large for people who were never intended to get it. I mean, keep in mind the original ACA, as I said, stopped at 400% of the federal poverty line. In New York City, couples with no children earning 1,000% of the federal poverty line, so more than double the original ACA threshold, would be eligible of premium tax credits of more than $3,000 a year. So it's wildly generous, especially at the higher ends relative to the original intent of the ACA. And we just think there's a more rational middle ground that smooths the benefit cliff, but doesn't give very generous benefits to folks at the top.
And I think that 400% is around 65,000. That's not off the top of my head, but I think I read that
Yeah,
somewhere
it's
around
not,
there. So
it's not, it's relatively middle income.
yeah.
So it's a pretty bad place to have a benefit cliff. I know there were some conversations about putting a new benefit cliff in, that's a little bit higher, and that has pros and cons. But it's a really bad place to have a benefit cliff. So right now, a lot of the proposals are an income cap. It's roughly around $200,000 a year. And the plus side is the cliff is not as steep if you do that, and fewer people are affected by it. But as a result, you're not really saving any money if you just extend the current system. Put that cliff, at $200,000, you still have a cliff, but now it's not really saving any money. So it's almost the worst.
Yeah, and that's one of the problems with just the plain extension is that it doesn't do anything about underlying healthcare reform.
Well, yeah, that's a whole separate issue. Is one of our big criticisms when this was done, or rather not when it was done, but when it was extended in the IRA, is we can't, when healthcare is so expensive, and a big part of why it's so expensive is we just funnel money at it without the right strings attached. We're just actually driving up prices and shifting the cost to taxpayers rather than bringing down the underlying cost of healthcare. And so our position has been anything that is extending these credits, which again, we do support some extension of the credit, should be of the expanded credit, should be paired with things that will actually address the underlying drivers of healthcare cost inflation.
Okay, we're going to have to take our first break, and we'll talk about some of those things that might help with the underlying healthcare cost. You're listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and I'm talking with Ben Ritz, Vice President of Policy Development at the Progressive Policy Institute. We'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and I'm talking with Ben Ritz, Vice President of Policy Development at the Progressive Policy Institute. We're talking about what Congress does now that they've reopened the government with all the same problems. So we were talking about the expiring enhanced ACA, Affordable Care Act, healthcare subsidies, which is a big problem. And apparently there will be a vote on some form of extension or reform or something in the Senate in December. So we're talking about the existing subsidies and the flaws in the just doing a straight extension. At PPI, Ben, you put out a couple of issue briefs about maybe what they should do, how to maybe reform the original ACA subsidies in a way that would make them more fair, rational, whatever, fiscally responsible, and do something to help slow underlying healthcare costs. So, what have you been advocating?
So we're advocating for an extension, but with a few tweaks. So the first is, for the first year, what we propose is they extend the current formula, but rather than right now where someone's expected contribution to health insurance is capped at 8.5% of income, no matter how high their income is. We propose that threshold keep rising with income. So again, when somebody is lower income, they pay less than 8.5%. That scales up until it hits 8.5. We propose that it keeps scaling up as income rises, and that will phase out the tax credit faster for high income households without creating a benefit cliff. The second thing we propose is that over time, that whole subsidy structure shift from where it is today to somewhere halfway between where it is today and where it was when the original ACA was passed. Because again, we think the blanket extension across the board is probably too expensive and not necessarily ideal for long-term policy. That the right way to get healthcare costs under control is not by just ratcheting up subsidies, but rather is by having folks by actually tackling the underlying drivers of healthcare. Which brings us to the next component of our plan, which is how we pay for it. We propose that it be paid for with two policy reforms, primarily using Medicare to get costs down. The first is the No Upcode Act, and what this policy would do is it would prevent Medicare Advantage insurers from trying to find artificial ways to increase the subsidy they get for each person they take on. Right now, the government provides higher payments to private insurers who participate in Medicare Advantage if they take on sicker individuals. That just makes sense because they have higher costs. But they artificially increase how sick somebody looks. And so No Upcode Act would crack down on those enhancements. And then the other policy we propose is site neutral payment reform. Medicare often pays a higher rate to services that are performed in a hospital setting than if the same service is performed at an independent physician office. Not only does that lead to us wasting a lot of money on paying more for the same procedure done at a different setting, but also it encourages consolidation because for independent physicians, if they get acquired by a hospital system, then suddenly they're eligible for a higher reimbursement rate, even if they're not really changing anything about their practice. And so what site neutral payment reform does is not only are we saving money by lowering the premium that's paid to hospitals, but also we're discouraging that consolidation, which promotes competition. And as we all know from basic Econ 101, more competition drives down prices. So you take that together, that package gives you something that allows us to extend the ACA tax credit in some form for a longer term, permanently gets rid of the benefit cliff, and fully pays for it with policies that actually bend the healthcare cost curve rather than simply moving the cost of it onto taxpayers.
So if just a straight extension costs around 350 billion or something like that over 10 years, what is how would this proposal of yours, would that cost something or would it save money?
So the gross cost of the premium tax credit extension that we propose, if it's made permanent, and so again, we propose a largely extending what we have now for 1 year, and then over the next 3 years, gradually ratcheting it to something that's halfway between the current structure and the original ACA. If we did it exactly like that, it would be somewhere between $175 billion and $200 billion over the next 10 years. And then these pay-fors would take it from being from having a cost to actually being deficit reducing.
Um, do you have, I mean, there are going to be some proposals already. We're seeing some things floating around on the Hill. I guess there are going to be, various iterations of this. Are there any positive developments from your point of view on some of the proposals that you're hearing about?
Yeah, so I mean, we have one proposal from I think it's Congressman Kevin Kiley and Sam Liccardo of California. They propose a 2-year extension of the ACA, the current enhanced premium tax credit, and they propose to pay for it with one of those pay-fors we suggested, the No Upcode Act, and they pair it with an income cap that's around $200,000. I think that's better than a lot of ideas that have been bandied around. I still think that just as I said earlier, just moving the income cap up is not really the right way to do this. I also think that a 2-year extension doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. You're really just kicking the can down the road at that point. Right now, we're a year out from the next election, and 2 years from now, we will still be a year out from the next election. I don't know what is going to change in the next 2 years, other than we'll have procrastinated more. And so I think, at most we should be doing a 1-year extension with a focus on moving to long-term policy. And then again, I also think that we should be trying to do more to make it less expensive over time. But I think it's certainly better than some of the proposals that are either straight extension or straight expiration.
Um, what about some of the Republican ideas? I mean, the administration has floated low-cost plans, health savings accounts. Do those have any merit in terms of picking up the slack?
I'm not a huge fan of them. I think, the reason why low cost plans are low cost is because they often don't cover very much. I think health savings accounts can, they work well for people who are generally healthy, and it's a good, and they're also an incredibly good tax advantage, probably in a way that's even more generous than they should be. Um, and so I don't love them because, again, if you're healthy, it's a great deal, but if you're sick, it doesn't really do very much for you. And I think we should be really trying to make healthcare more accessible and affordable for the people with great healthcare needs, not just saving a little bit for people who are already healthy. I think the other issue is doing a big radical reform like that, with a month to go while open enrollment is going on. I think it's going to be incredibly hard to implement. I mean, I think already the reforms I have been talking about that I advocate for are getting increasingly difficult to implement. And I'm starting to think, if they were to enact it in legislation in December, what changes have to be made just for practical purposes. And what the Republicans are proposing is a much more ambitious change. So I think it's not very practical right now.
Um, another thing is the conditions of the reopening. I mean, there's no guarantee that the House is going to take up anything.
Right, and I think that's a big part of why our message to Democrats is stop focusing on straight extension and start focusing on reforms. Because if you put up a bill that's just a 1-year extension, no strings attached, it probably doesn't pass the Senate. Even if it does, it probably doesn't, it almost certainly doesn't pass the House. I know Democrats are hoping to do a discharge petition to force a vote in the House, but that might not even come to fruition before open enrollment ends. And so, I think the more Democrats wed themselves to full extension or bust, the more likely it is that all they get is bust.
Well, we'll have to keep an eye on that, and I will talk more about this on the other side of the break. You're listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and I'm talking with Ben Ritz, Vice President of Policy Development at the Progressive Policy Institute. And what we're discussing is the congressional agenda as they get back to work after the shutdown, including the expiring enhanced ACA subsidies. And we'll talk on the other side about some of the politics of that, the president's tariff agenda, and even Social Security reform. We'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and I'm talking with Ben Ritz, Vice President of Policy Development at the Progressive Policy Institute. We're talking about the congressional agenda now that the government is reopened. And mostly we've been talking about what they do about expiring enhanced ACA subsidies, which means that a lot of people that get their health insurance on the Affordable Care Act exchanges will see increases in their premiums and will let their politicians know about it. The problem is extending those enhanced subsidies is very, very expensive. And so we've been talking about alternatives, and Ben was laying out some of his ideas. You know, the ACA subsidies were really at the core of this shutdown. That was the issue. I mean, technically speaking, the government shut down not because of ACA subsidies, but because Congress hadn't passed its 12 appropriation bills or come anywhere close. And they've still only passed 3 of them. So there's still 9 left hanging out there. And we may have another shutdown in January because for the rest of the government, it's only funded through January. Ben, what, was it worth it? I mean, what are the politics of these shutdowns? Were the Democrats able to get something out of this in terms of focusing the debate? Or when you look at the quote unquote accomplishments, it doesn't look like much was accomplished. Maybe a vote in the Senate, but no guaranteed vote in the House. So anyway, what are you, just as a putting on your political strategist hat, what do you think about shutdowns as a strategy?
I think it's really hard to say whether the shutdown was worth it. I'll lay out why it may have been and why it wouldn't have been. What I will say is the idea that Republicans were going to cave and just let us do a straight ACA extension while the government was shut down, in the way that a lot of my friends on the left say was the goal, that was never going to happen. And if that was the metric of success, this was always doomed to be a failure. I think we have seen historically with shutdowns, shutting down the government for a demand that is unrelated, that's not directly related to appropriations, which, again, the government shuts down because you don't pass appropriation. So shutting it down over an unrelated policy dispute historically, it has never, ever worked for the party that has done so. We saw in 2013, when Republicans shut down the government to try to repeal or weaken the Affordable Care Act, Democrats said no. People forget this was right on the heels of the botched rollout of healthcare.gov. And so it was like an extremely weak moment for the ACA, and Republicans still completely got crushed during the shutdown. Democrats overwhelmingly led the generic congressional ballot after that. And so, the precedent is just not good for the party that does this. That said, if you look at the polling right now, more people blame Republicans for the shutdown than Democrats. More people say that it was better for Democrats to hold out for the enhanced subsidies than reopen the government to let them expire. So politically, it actually seems to have worked better for Democrats than even I would have thought at the start of it. But I think in terms of policy wins, we're not really seeing that much. Now, to get to the question of this December vote, could Democrats have gotten this vote without a commitment for anything passing without shutting down the government? I think that's unclear. You listen to Republicans And it sounds like it's something they could have gotten pretty easily. If not before the shutdown, then in the first couple days. They didn't need to wait 40 days for it. Democrats seem to think they wouldn't have, and I would be lying if I said I knew for sure. The last thing I want to talk about is something that was directly relevant to appropriations that Democrats got that I think is being underappreciated. Senator Tim Kaine, as a condition of his vote, demanded that there be no blanket reductions in force for the duration of the CR. And basically what that means is Trump can't just fire civil servants without replacing them without congressional approval. I think if that's the only thing that came out of the shutdown, that could potentially, if it's extended beyond just this continuing resolution, if this ends up being precedent for full year appropriations, that could be a bigger win for Democrats than any policy that I thought they would get out of the shutdown. So, I mean, was it worth it? Pros and cons. We haven't even talked about all the damage, economic damage that the shutdown did. And so, you know, you have to weigh the benefits against those costs. But in terms of what the benefits were, you know, I think there's an argument both ways.
Two things come to mind. I mean, one, do you think we're going to go through all this again at the end of January? I mean, suppose that there is not an ACA bill passed in December, and there may well not be. You bump up against the next shutdown deadline at the end of January. You will see, if nothing is settled, you will see that issue come back again. Should we shut down the government? I'm not sure if there's the appetite for that.
So there will be another shutdown over the ACA tax credits. If we get to January, open enrollment has now been done for a month. You know, we had the votes. We tried to strike a deal. I would be really surprised if we did this again over the ACA. There may, by the way, there may still be ongoing discussions to resurrect the credit in some form. But, you know, at that point, it's something, you know, people probably get it on their taxes rather than when they buy insurance. It's, you know, it's more forward looking. I just don't see that happen. But we have to get agreement on appropriations. We just got, you know, some easy appropriations bills done. 3 of the easiest bills were passed as part of the deal to reopen the government. Hard ones are still out there. What strings are attached, like this reduction in force language? Are there other strings attached on rescissions? You know, what the actual policy is, what the spending levels are. We could have a shutdown over those. I would say that's a more, you know, germane shutdown than over an unrelated policy issue. And so to some extent that might even make more sense than this shutdown. But I would hope that people are just tired of it. We ran its course with this shutdown, and hopefully we don't let that happen.
Well, there's, you know, you raise the rescissions question. I've been fascinated, kind of, I guess fascinated isn't quite the right word. It's, you know, I've been very, very, very surprised at Congress's willingness to cede the power of the purse. And, you know, that goes to the rescissions question. I know there was some talk about putting language in that would make it clear that the president could not so-called pocket rescind things. In other words, making a rescission at the end of the year that Congress didn't have time to act on, and then saying, so that's it. You can't spend the money. I think that there's a lot of room for rescission reform and for Congress to get back the power of the purse, but that didn't seem to come up in this context.
Well, the interesting thing is it did and it didn't, and this maybe was my the biggest source of my frustration. Being a Democratic policy person, is you talk to Democrats on the Hill, and then, you know, a lot of the experts, and they would say the big issue is power of the purse. You know, we need, like, the real reason to shut down the government is Donald Trump unconstitutionally rescinding appropriations, and why would we give him more appropriations for him to rescind it without congressional approval? If we just agree to a deal that he's going to renege on, what's the point of it? I actually think that would have been if we were going to shut down the government over anything, I think that was the best reason to shut down the government. But all of the messaging, and as far as the public was concerned, the only reason for the shutdown was the ACA credits. And so now the flip side of that is I think the ACA credits probably were a more politically popular reason to shut down the government. So you have this really weird tension between the substantively best reason to shut down the government and the politically best reason to shut down the government. And they're almost completely the worst possible metric on they're the worst possible reason on the other metric. And so I think that has kind of muddled for Democrats what it is they actually want to get out of this, what it is they actually need to get out of this. And I think that cognitive dissonance is going to come to a head toward the next deadline.
It's funny. I absolutely agree with you. The substantive issue, if you were going to shut down the government, would be we can't make deals on appropriations if the president is just going to not spend things that we have agreed on. That means the deal is just a non-starter to begin with. And so that's a reason to hold up appropriations until you get clarity on that and some of these constitutional questions. But if you start saying, people are not getting paid and the TSA isn't getting paid and the air traffic controllers aren't getting paid and SNAP benefits aren't going out because you want to prevent a pocket rescission, that's a tough sell.
Exactly. Now, one other thing, though, we should note, one thing Democrats got is SNAP funding for the full year. So the next shutdown, if there is one, will not have SNAP on the table. And I think that has the potential to change the dynamics. I mean, if they'd also passed permanent pay for air traffic controllers, then, really the pressure might have been off at that point.
Yeah, well, and I guess people aren't going to look into the way that the military was paid because there was some pretty shady things going on there too in terms of shifting accounts.
Oh yeah, I mean, it was this weird situation where the Trump administration was saying, well, the precedent is troops always get paid during the shutdown, but that was because Congress would pass bills to pay the troops in some form or another, whether that was an explicit bill or the DoD appropriation had already been paid, had already been passed. And so they took a completely unprecedented and possibly illegal legal maneuver to do an action that had a lot of precedent. And so like both sides said what they were doing was the precedent, and it's just kind of...
Well, and that's one of those things where who's going to complain?
Right.
People are going to stand up and say, no, the troops shall not be paid,
I mean,
So,
that's one of the biggest challenges with the way the Trump administration, I think, regularly violates the Constitution on budget issues is, if they do it by spending money that hasn't been approved, or rescinding money that taxpayers, don't have a big political investment in, and that nobody can demonstrate a concrete harm, there's no standing to sue, and they can just get away with it, or the money's already out the door, and so
yeah, I mean, try and stop me. I just did it. We're going to have to take another break now. You're listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and I'm talking with Ben Ritz of the Progressive Policy Institute. We'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and I'm talking with Ben Ritz. He's Vice President of Policy Development at the Progressive Policy Institute. And once upon a time, he was my intern at the Concord Coalition. That was a long time ago. Well, maybe not too long ago, but
no, it was pretty long ago, Bob.
yeah, it was pretty long ago. Yeah,
at least on my time horizon. It's a long time.
exactly. Well, anyway, it's your hair is still the same color. Mine may be a little bit different, but anyway. Okay, we were talking about the power of the purse and how Congress has let the administration take a rather aggressive approach to spending, but we've also got the taxing power on the table here. There's a case currently before the Supreme Court, which is arguing that a lot of the tariffs that have been imposed by President Trump exceed the authority that he has under an emergency statute that he's cited. And the Supreme Court is going to tell us whether they're constitutional or not. But you've been making the case since the campaign that a heavy reliance on tariffs is not a great way to do taxation.
Exactly. I mean, there have been some stories out recently just about how much businesses have had to sink manpower into just trying to comply with these Byzantine tariffs where what my colleague Ed Gresser pointed out, the Trump administration, to make these tariffs as broad as possible, they are applying their steel and aluminum tariffs to condensed milk because the container has steel and aluminum. Like, clearly not how this law is designed. But I don't know if that's even an IEEPA tariff. They're using so many different legal authorities to justify the tariffs. But it's a constantly moving target. They keep changing the policy. They try to make them as aggressive as possible in ways it wasn't intended. The rates are all over the place. And businesses are just struggling to keep up. And I saw a quote from one CEO who said, all of the time and energy that we used to put into innovation, into trying to develop new, cheaper products for our consumers, we are now spending on compliance for tariffs and trying to figure out like how we can not just pay, not just minimize the tariff costs for consumers, but not break the law. And so it's incredibly cumbersome and I think very costly, and obviously not the way tax policy should be made. And sorry, one other point I want to make on that is Trump is depending on the revenue for a lot of his deficit claims. He's saying that the deficit going down last year was the result of tariffs, and that's partially true, by the way. But he's also saying that this is leverage to make a trade deal, and if that's the case, well, then it's not permanent revenue. And so things like the tariff rebate he's talking about, which, by the way, he already spent that tariff rebate in the one big beautiful bill. It's just he's counting on that revenue for a bunch of different things, and it's unstable and not something that can be relied upon.
Yeah, and he and his advisors have been insisting that it wouldn't stoke inflation, and yet they've dialed back some of the tariffs on consumer goods because of rising prices. So
Exactly.
there are some inconsistencies there. I want to move on to a major proposal that you have made at the Progressive Policy Institute on Social Security reform, because if we look beyond what's going to happen with the next shutdown cliff and that sort of thing, this is really one of the major questions facing our nation and our politicians and the people, is the pending insolvency of the Social Security Trust Fund and Medicare Part A as well. But let's focus on Social Security. You've had looked at this and tried to do something that sort of moves beyond simple trust fund solvency, which is just kind of a math question, and looked at, could you design the system a little bit better? Give me the high level version of your proposal.
Sure. So at the core of our proposal is this idea that instead of awarding benefits based on how much somebody earns, we should award benefits based on how much they work. And the idea here is that right now, Social Security gives higher benefits to people who have higher lifetime earnings. And the reason is because the designers of Social Security wanted it to be an earned benefit based on how much you pay in. The more you pay in, the more you get out. The problem is that the current generation of retirees did not pay in enough to cover their benefits. And so the trust funds are going to run out. Now, thanks to the one big beautiful bill, that exhaustion is going to be in 2032, before the end of the next president's term. And so we have to do something about that. And a lot of the proposals out there to fix the program, whether it is by raising taxes on the rich without giving them commensurate benefit increases, or reducing benefits at the top, without any changes to the tax side, they fundamentally strain or break that link between contributions and benefits. And so we at PPI thought, okay, if this system linking the direct contributions you paid and benefits isn't going to hold up anymore, how could we design the system to be better without trying to uphold that link, which is basically going to break no matter what at this point.
And how would, so you're switching from, is it essentially a flat benefit that you're looking at if it's based on work rather than earnings?
It's a flat benefit per year of work, but I think that's a really important distinction because, as I said, at its inception, Social Security was designed to be an earned benefit that is overwhelmingly popular with the voters. Voters do not like the idea that no matter how much you paid in, how much you work, you get the same amount out. And so the idea of our work credit system is it's still an earned benefit. If you work hard, if you want Social Security, you have to work hard to get it. And the harder you work, the more you get. But we don't give you a bigger benefit just because you earned more. And that's a really important principle because the idea that we are taxing working Americans more to pay more benefits to the people who had the highest income and paid less in taxes during their working lives, that doesn't make sense to us. And so we keep it as an earned benefit, but we make it flatter on the income dimension.
And you also include for the first time, I think that there would be credit given for caregiving for parents as well.
Yep, absolutely. And that's something that actually I think only works under our proposals. There are proposals to add such a thing to the current system, but it doesn't quite make sense if you're doing it based on payroll taxes paid, because caregiving you're not paying payroll taxes. Whereas if you're doing a work credit system, you say, if you're doing work, whether that's paid work or caregiving, work is work. I think another thing that's important about that aspect is, the biggest issue with Social Security is the ratio of payroll tax paying beneficiaries to retirees drawing from the system. And so the biggest thing somebody can do to improve the solvency of Social Security is have kids. And so that Social Security penalizes them for taking time out of the workforce for kids doesn't really make a whole lot of sense if you want it to be a contributory system. It's the greatest contribution you can make. And so our system, recognizes that contribution and rewards people appropriately for it.
And now on the pain side, you do have a few things to improve the system's sustainability, like raising the eligibility age, changing the COLAs, and some new revenue. Yeah, I mean, there's a major change that you've proposed in the revenue.
Yeah, so I mean, look, there's no one silver bullet for Social Security anymore. We think that it's going to take a package of reforms. Our plan overall would fix the program roughly half through benefits changes and half through tax increases. But it's relatively balanced. We do raise the retirement age, but we have a special early retirement age for lifetime low income workers who can or people who can no longer work. That basically shields them from cuts if they can't afford to work longer, or they physically can't work longer. We reduce COLAs so that they are more in line with actual inflation. Right now, inflation adjustments overstate. Right now, cost of living adjustments overstate inflation. We use a slower growing, more accurate metric, but we include higher cost of living increases for the oldest retirees who are most likely to outlive their savings. So this doesn't become a compounding cut over time. And then importantly, we propose a big revenue change, as you said. The payroll tax heavily undermines the progressivity of the income tax. It's an anti-work tax. It's anti-worker, and it places the burden exclusively on working Americans, and it's not very economically efficient. What we propose is to move over towards a consumption tax, which it raises more revenue. It spreads the burden of financing Social Security, not just on the next generation, but everybody pays in. And because it's a tax on consumption, it encourages savings and investment, and is more pro-growth and is a more efficient revenue source.
And then is that all taken together sustainably solvent?
One of the things that our plan leaves open is what to do about the trust fund accounting system. I think there are pros and cons to it, and you could make it work either way, either with the trust fund system or without it. What I will say is these policies together do the equivalent of making the program fully solvent. And we did them as part of a comprehensive budget blueprint that put the federal budget on a path to balance within 20 years. So is it fully, if you ran it through a 75-year solvency calculation would you get there? I'm actually not sure. But I do know for sure that it is a fiscally sustainable approach to the problem.
And that really is the more important point, really. I mean, the trust fund is a bookkeeping mechanism, and what's more important is the sustainability of the federal budget. So, Ben, I mean, this is somewhat imminent as a political issue as well, isn't it?
Yeah, so as we said earlier, this is something that's going to happen in the next president's term. So it really should be an issue in the next presidential election. But something I think folks aren't thinking about as much is that it should be an issue in the midterms because senators serve for 6 years, and the senators who are elected next November are going to be the ones who are voting on what to do about Social Security, or conversely, are going to be not voting and letting across the board benefit cuts take place. And so I think that's a really imminent political issue in a way that people haven't been thinking about it for quite some time.
We're going to have to leave it there. This has been quite a tour de force here, Ben, going through the issues before Congress. I appreciate your taking the time. You've been listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and I have been talking with Ben Ritz, Vice President of Policy Development at the Progressive Policy Institute. And I'll be back next week with another edition of Facing the Future.